We've had 2 sessions already, and this is the 3rd one. And what we're going to talk about today really follows on very closely from what we did last time. But I hope it will also make sense if you haven't been able to join the earlier sessions. And I will give a very quick overview at the beginning. And the rules of engagement are the same as before. We hope to make this interactive, and there will be a good part of the time where we go into groups to discuss a particular issue. All right, so this one says the involving farmers around the research cycle, session 3, more on engaging negotiating research designs. So the original plan for this topic was this one. We said we were going to have a research cycle, then we're going to talk about the designing studies, and then we're going to talk about data, and then we're going to talk about analysis. And in fact, we only got halfway through the design topic 2 weeks ago. So what we're going to do today is continue that discussion of 2 weeks ago. And I've said it's still to be decided what we do in the 4th one, whether we truncate things a little bit and squeeze what would originally be 2 topics into one, or whether we want to continue with a 5th session in this series. But we can discuss that at the end. So all these sessions include some, I hope, brief presentations, some chance to discuss some practical work, something we do in groups, and opportunities to ask and answer questions. So just as a reminder, the research cycle has been described in many different ways, even though that's fundamentally the same every time. And the way it's interpreted for farmer research networks is this one. It starts off somewhere by getting engaged. We start up the process of researchers and farmers and others getting together and doing some sort of understanding of what's going on and setting some priorities perhaps. But eventually the group, the FRN, specifies some problems or research questions or options that they want to work on. They design an approach and a research design. They engage in some data collection. They analyze the data. They interpret the results and decide what to do next. And the cycle goes round again. And we know that people engaging in work with farmers for 30 years have typically claimed that they are using participatory methods, meaning that farmers are involved in some of these steps. But if you look at what actually happens on the ground, it's quite common that farmers are involved in this step of saying, what's the problem? And thereafter, much of what happens is driven primarily by researchers. And one of the principles of the farmer research networks is that farmers, farmer representatives, FRN members are fully engaged in all steps of this cycle. And when we talk about that, people say, wait a minute, what do you mean? How is that possible? And that's the topic of this series. And it was raised as a challenge in the East Africa Community of Practice meeting last October. And that's why we decided to run this series. It's a challenge for all sorts of reasons, but in particular, these FRN principles say, yes, farmers are involved, farmers are empowered. But what does it mean for a farmer, for example, to be empowered to analyze data? Does it mean they're all going to go away and learn statistics? No, that's not what we mean. So what do we mean instead? It means that there are joint decisions taking. And when you have diverse people with diverse views trying to take a joint decision, then it involves negotiation. And actually, when we were last week talking about choosing an approach to a problem, to a particular research question and a design, then we said, look, there's sort of 2 parts to this. These are 2 parts are connected, but one part is actually what is number 2 here is actually producing a design. You know, you're used, as researchers, you're used to coming up with experimental designs. And so, hey, we have to come up with a design. But to do that, there's this process of co-creation, of discussion, of negotiation. And what we looked at last week was exactly that one. How does that work? What does it take to do that well? How should it be done? And then the second step is, all right, when you've got that working, what are the sorts of designs that you can come up with? And that requires us to reflect quite deeply on what a good design actually is. And which of those rules for research designs that we learned when we were studying and learning about research methods, which of those rules still apply? Which are the sort of non-negotiables? And what actually can we adapt, modify, update from sort of usual practice of the way some of this research is done, and still do something that is useful and valid? So we did number one in the last session, and we're going to do number two today. But that number one, if you remember, what happened was we had an interaction between an FRN group leader and a researcher, and they had an argument. The FRN group leader was unusually robust in expressing the point of views of their members, and the scientist was a little bit dismissive and said, basically, I'm a scientist, I know how to do research, you do it my way. We looked at the video of that interaction between the scientists and the pharma group leader, and you discussed what it showed and what needed to be different. And the summary, I've pulled this from the notes that you made at the end of that group work last time, and this is a summary of what we are finding out. First of all, currently, what's happening is, when we looked at the interaction between the farmers and researchers here, they were both expressing needs and concerns. However, there is a clear power imbalance. Whether you like it or not, the researcher is more empowered. They've got the education. They're more confident to talk about things and argue about things. They've got the money usually. In most of our cases, it's the researcher that manages the budget. They turn up in a car, and so on. So that power imbalance is there. What it means, as researchers or others who are more empowered than typical farmers, then it's your responsibility to use that power and influence you have well and wisely to generate a good process and effective problem solving. Okay, so you're in an important position there to use the power that you have. And in the video we saw, the researcher was tending to use the power to try and persuade the farmers how things should be done. They were not seeking to understand differences of opinion. And true also, the farmers weren't seeking to understand why the researchers thought it should be done some way. It was a very one-way process, and people said, this is what we want. And nobody said, why? Can you explain? Let me understand better why you think that's important. That didn't happen at all. So both sides were making assumptions about the context, about their respective interests, and about what makes good research. And so we said what needs to change is it needs to become a negotiation and a co-creation process where the two sides, or more, if your FRN includes more people, come together around a common objective. They make compromises. They recognize the validity of diverse knowledge. They seek to understand each other, asking questions about why, please explain, rather than just trying to persuade that things should be done one way. And doing that requires good social capital. You have to have a good relationship between the researchers and the farmers and the others involved, the NGOs and extension officers, whoever else is there. If the researchers or the project team are just seen as benefactors, people that come with something good, like new seed varieties, then this doesn't work. Secondly, you need good facilitation skills. And it's interesting that in lots of our projects, The researcher is also the facilitator. And I'm not sure that that is an ideal mix. You know, maybe a sort of neutral facilitator would be ideal. A facilitator who can kind of help both sides have the discussion and do this negotiation, rather than one side also being like the referee of the process. It requires flexibility. It does require understanding research principles, and we'll come to some of those in a minute. And it requires everybody to genuinely value those farmer interests and knowledge and capability, rather than just saying, yes, yes, we respect farmers' views. Actually putting that into practice is a requirement. So that's a very brief summary of all the things that we went through last week. Okay, so we will go on. And what I want to do today is we're going to look at the same case again, but this time focus not on the process of negotiation, but on the actual outcomes, the consequences. What does it mean? Who's right? How do we balance these alternative views? What are some of the possible things that could be done, which will meet the requirements of both researchers and farmers? When is a position sort of non-negotiable? That's what we're going to look at today. Okay, so just as a reminder of the situation, we've got farmers and researchers and a local NGO that have been working together in an FRN for some years. So they know each other. This isn't new. They've done experiments together before. They've particularly done experiments on soil management and some post-harvest options. The FRN works with farmer groups of about 20 members, and each group has a leader. And we were looking at the interaction between a group leader and a researcher. Now the FRN group has decided that they're going to do something on cowpea. It's widely grown in the area and farmers use it for both grain and for leaves. That farmers say that there are lots of pest and disease problems with the cowpea. The researchers bringing their knowledge in say, well, we could see that you're using just a few local varieties and there are a number of improved varieties available. And so they've agreed together, farmers and researchers have agreed together that trying some new varieties is a priority. And the researchers have done their homework and come up with 10 possible varieties to try. And now we come to, okay, how do we do this trial, which seeks to look at these 10 varieties? And what we showed last time is that the researchers have a suggestion and the farmers have a counter suggestion. And we're going to try and look at what's involved in these two alternatives for each of these different points. And to start that off, we're going to have another video of the researcher and the farmer group leader just taking us through their view of what each of these points about the design should be. Watch the video. This slide, which is on the screen at the moment, will also be shown as they're talking in the video. Take some notes of anything that occurs to you as you hear them discussing, because at the end of the video, we're going to go into groups and talk about each of these points in some detail.
I am Dr. Sayanzi, the researcher proposing a design for an FRN trial on cowpea varieties. I would like to outline the design I think we should use.
Good afternoon. I am Mama Kulima, the FRN group leader. Our members want to experiment with new cowpea varieties, but would like to do it in a different way.
The trial only needs to be done by 10 farmers. These are like 10 blocks. So we will select 10 very good farmers from the FRN members, and these will do the trial in the same way.
All our members want to take part. We like to do things together, and everyone is interested in cowpeas and wants to try the new varieties.
There are 10 new varieties, so all the participating farmers will plant all of them so that we get the same amount of data on each, and we will be able to analyze the data and compare the varieties.
Our members do not all want to plant all the 10 varieties. Some of them don't have space for all the 10 varieties. A few members already know some of the varieties and they don't want to include those in the trial. So each member will select which new varieties they want to test on their farm.
Each farmer will also have a plot of their current local variety as a control to compare to the new varieties.
We will not include our usual varieties because we know very well how those varieties perform.
We will use 5 by 5 meter plots so they are large enough to get a good idea of the performance and any pest problems. The plants on the outside of the plot will be guard rows and we will only sample and analyze data from the middle of the plot.
We would like to use 3 by 2 meter plots. 5 by 5 meter plots take up too much land and it is a lot of work, which will be wasted if the cowpeas do not do well.
The experiment should be done in the main field used for their local variety cowpeas so that we know the soil is representative.
Our members will choose which land they can spare for the experiment.
Trials need to be replicated, so we will have 2 plots of each variety on each of the 10 farms. So in total, we will have n equals 20 replications for each variety to analyze and compare them.
Each member will plant just 1 plot of each of the varieties they are trying because doing it twice is simply double the work.
No manure or fertilizer will be used on any plot and they will not be intercropped with maize, so we can see the real potential of the varieties without other things interfering.
Our members grow cowpeas in different ways, some intercropped and some with fertilizer or manure. So each member will grow the new varieties as they want.
Planting time is important, so all the farmers in the trial will plant the experiment on the same day.
Farmers have to plant when they are ready, and each member will decide when to plant their trial.
The cowpeas will be grown until the grain is ripe and ready for harvest. We will then measure the total yield from the plot minus the guard rows. Harvesting leaves reduces grain yield, so no leaves should be removed before harvesting the grain.
Our members depend on cowpea leaves for food. If there are varieties that produce good leaves, we will harvest them for eating before the grain is ready.
Thank you to Dr. Sayansi and Mama Kolima for stating your positions so clearly. Now, we'll have this on the screen when we go into groups. What we want to do is look at the case being made by the farmer and the researcher, and think about it. There are quite differences of opinion and requirements here. Can you think of designs that might work, that would meet the requirements of everybody? When the researcher is saying, some of the things they want to do because it's kind of scientifically necessary, is that strictly correct? When the farmers are making a claim about, we don't want to do this or don't want, are they being realistic, or do they have unrealistic expectations? So we want to discuss these and think about either what design might be a good compromise, or something which is neither of these, but something original that meets both sets of requirements, or what further things would you need to know if you were actually in that meeting? What sort of things would you be asking to be able to help come up with a decent suggestion? And I've grouped these 3 parts of the design, and we'll go, rather than have each group look at all of them, I would like group number 1 to focus on the first 3 rows of this table. And this is really about who's involved and the treatments. Group number 2 will focus on the middle 3 rows of this table. That's about the plots and where their plot size and where the experiment is done, and about replication. And then the third group, it's really focusing on the management and the measurement and the harvest. So we're going to groups. You'll be put into one of those groups. There should be somebody in the group that will facilitate it, and somebody that knows where to take some notes. And then we'll have feedback where we look at basically each row of the table and see what sort of ideas have come up. So welcome back. I hope you are indeed back, and we'll have a quick feedback of what sort of discussion went on. And let's try and spend, no more than 5 minutes or so from each group. Who was leading on group 1?
Romina was taking our notes, and I was asking questions from the team.
Who's going to take us through? Let me do that.
We did not
Okay.
decide.
Okay, then Carlos.
Right.
So group 1, how many farmers? There was a debate about whether the researcher was right or the farmer was right. And they said that it is difficult to force farmers to participate, and especially difficult to force farmers to have all the same number of varieties, so that some flexibility is necessary. A researcher needs to adjust the conditions that is imposing on the farmers. They need to engage with farmers and discuss how they fit into the design, and it's for the researcher to make some of this analysis. But perhaps one of the most important things is that if not all farmers choose to participate, if there is flexibility, it is important to find out from those who chose not to participate why, and perhaps also from those who chose that they wanted to participate why they are doing so. And the same happens with the choice of the number of treatments and the choice of the treatments. And allowing for different number of treatments is important, because some farmers might not have the resources to participate in full. Now that produces problems, and we didn't get into depth about what problems it will produce for the researcher, except that probably the research questions are going to be different from the ones that the researcher is used to deal with in a research station. The second question was why not about the choices of farmers. And farmers are limited by their land availability, and allowing farmers to choose will help them appreciate the results. The other thing is, I'm reading, no need is better. Yes, the thing about asking farmers why they choose, the researcher, if working with enough farmers, will be able to have information about all the varieties, even if not all the farmers have the same. And we came to the discussion of, so what happens then with an analysis if we have farmers with different varieties and different number of plots, and there is no clear understanding of or ability to explain why that would be a problem, and why researchers tend to want to have equal number of varieties in it for each farmer. And there was the possibility of asking for clarification of what are the consequences of that different number of plots in it for each farmer, and how we can deal with it, and the consequences of that on sharing results with other researchers. With the control is that, yes, the researcher wants to know what happens in comparison to normal conditions, but that is a researcher need. Farmers normally will know what happens under normal conditions, and they are interested in what happens with the new things, and that's why they might be reluctant to allocate a land for a control. But then the fact that a farmer grows cowpea means that there will be a control by default, and perhaps we can use the land that they are plots that they already have with cowpea, rather than having to follow the prescription of the researcher who wants a plot that is a control per se. And I think that is mainly the end of the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Group 1. We'll have a few minutes to hear comments from everybody when we've gone through the other two groups. Otherwise, we're going to run out of time. So I'm going to Group 2. And can somebody just take us through here?
So yeah, the first of the three things we had on the list was the plot size. And so there was a few different points made here. I think there's the question of if the researcher is insistent on having all 10 varieties and having 2 replicates, then that may dictate the maximum plot size available by the farmer. So there's a compromise in there which is linked to some of these other criteria. And perhaps if there was a smaller scale trial, and if there was a fewer replicates, just one replicate per farm, then it may be more possible for the farmer to easily compromise on that point, because it would give away the same amount of land. And then there was the second point, which was trying to understand, okay, what is actually a reasonable plot size? So we'd have questions about how many plants are the farmers likely to be planting within a 2x3 plot, and how much spacing is going to be used, and can we understand whether this is going to be sufficient to give us a reliable estimate of some of the things we want to be calculating in, and so a 2x3 plot is fine, or is it really needed that we do have a larger plot? So we would want to go back and have some of these discussions with the farmer and the researcher about exactly how the layout of the trials within a plot would be working. Then on the kind of location within the farm, the researcher is very interested in trying to capture, in this case, a kind of realistic plot of land where farmers may actually be planting real cowpea plots rather than trial cowpea plots. But the fertility of that main plot is still not going to be uniform anyway. So perhaps a more important thing is to be considering the quality of the land and capturing information about that, whether visually or capturing information through soil testing, to try to understand the quality of the land itself that we can maybe then adjust for later in some way, or take account of later some way in the analysis. And if we've captured that, then maybe it doesn't matter so much if the trial is happening on a main plot or the trial is happening on some other available land. And if there's again a smaller scale trial, then the issue of the farmer wanting to push the trial to the leftover bits of the plot may be less of an issue if we're dealing with something which is going to take up less of their total land. And I think there was generally a point that was made across all of the different aspects that I think Carlos also made as well, that the more ownership that the farmers have over the trial design and understanding of the intentions, then they're more likely to be continuing with the trial and more likely to be understanding of some of these points and willing to compromise if they feel that this is their own trial and it's not the researcher taking control of everything. So back to the point of making sure there is a strong communication about what is happening and ability to negotiate between the two parties. Then on to the final point of replication. There was the usual discussion of, okay, is a farmer a replicate? Is a farmer an experimental unit? How do we deal with this? The principle of replication within a farm may not be the same as the principle of replication across farms, and farmers are all going to do things their own way in different ways. So is it important to get an estimate of one particular farmer which is replicated, or is it better to again capture some of the data about why farmers are different and replicate the different treatments across multiple different farms and use that for the basis of our analysis? So yeah, I think we've had this discussion a few times again, and I think Ric will come back to this one again later.
Okay, all right. And the third one, Jane, can you take us through this one?
So we just had a couple of general comments, which was about that we thought ideally farmers should be managing their own fields, and also we recognised after the discussion that if, as researchers, we don't compromise, the farmers may not take ownership, may not be interested in managing the trial or interested in the result. So for manure and intercrop, we thought it was important that we should be doing it the farmer's usual way. But then we thought about, well, what does that mean? And are there any constraints we have to impose? And we thought that the important thing was that all plants in the farm should be managed the same. So if, for example, a farmer traditionally uses manure for their cowpeas and wants to use it, that's fine, but they should be using it for all of the plots so that they can compare between them. And so there was that discussion about giving guidance and things. Actually, all three elements, we had this idea that farm researchers should guide, and then we pulled ourselves up. Okay, we pulled ourselves up on it and said, but hang on, if we're co-creating, it shouldn't be us giving guidance. It should be an exchange of views. In some cases, the farmers giving guidance of what we need to do. So need to balance our objectives. For planting time, for some opinions was that it was very critical, but then we said, well, is there a sort of window of time that could be applicable? It is location specific, but obviously our FRN experiment in this case is probably all in the same sort of location. So again, we came back to this idea that we actually discussed with the farmers, what's the ideal planting time? And that it was emphasised that if researchers are going to persuade farmers to do something they don't want to do, then maybe we have to look at what we have to do to help the farmers in that case. So if we really think it's very important to plant at the same time, then they should help with preparation. But again, you could take the same approach, which would be that we talked about manure, which is that it's most important for one farmer to do everything the same on his plots. Harvesting leaves and grains, again, the Mama Kulima emphasised that it was very important. So we think that that basically should be incorporated into the design, and that we should actually be taking measurements, because this is something that the communities are interested in. So things like taste preference, it should say leaves, selection criteria, abundance, and that sort of thing. But we still need the grain yield, so there's a need to compromise and agree on how that works. There was a couple of extra ideas for that, like using the guard rows for leaves harvesting or having extra plots / replicas. Thank you.
Okay, lovely. Isn't it extraordinary how much there is to talk about? Remember when I introduced this example last time, I said, I picked this because it's sort of about the simplest sort of farmer experimentation we get involved in. And yet, look how immensely complicated it can be, how many things there are to think about. These materials, the recording of the meeting and these notes, for example, will be shared afterwards, so that if you were in group 1 and you want to read again what group 2 noted about this, then you can check that after the seminar. So, all right, I'm going to try and pull us through these strands together now. Okay, so we've had feedback from all the groups, and I'd prepared beforehand like my own feedback, and I'm not going to go through this in detail because we don't have time, but these were some of the things that I was thinking about to resolve these. And I was, in putting these down, I was trying to be principle based. And there's a principle about participation and opportunities to participate and equal representation and so on. And so the idea that we as researchers are only going to select a few farmers to do this, that just doesn't stand up against FRN principles. Okay, not that the principle says every farmer has to, but those opportunities need to be there, and a researcher coming along and saying, no, we only want some of you and the rest can go and do something else, that must be against FRN principles. Similarly, the idea that everybody needs to do the same thing in an experiment, if we thinking like farmers are like blocks or replicates and therefore they all need to be the same, that's transferring a concept from your researcher-led experimentation to this joint farmer experimentation, which is simply not necessary. As the group reporting on this said, there is no requirement when you think about how we're learning from experiments, how we're interpreting data, there is no requirement that everybody has the same set of treatments on their farms. It's quite clear that if only one farmer chooses to look at variety number 9, then we don't have much information about it. But it doesn't invalidate the information that we have on all the other varieties. Okay? And it doesn't invalidate the experiment. So we need to be quite clear about those items of research methods which are really important and which ones actually They're sort of a habit that we have when we do our scientist-led research, but they're not necessary to meet these objectives. These things on plot sizes, there's no right answer, but we do know from lots of experience two things. One, there are some traits of a variety which are pretty fixed. You plant one plant of it and you can see what it is. Like, let's take a flower color. You know, flower color doesn't vary depending on how it's grown or how fertile the soil is or something like that, as far as I know. So flower color is what you're evaluating. You can do it with one plant. On the other hand, something like the yield of leaves is probably going to be very variable, or the extent to which plants get infested by aphids is going to be very variable. And very small plots just aren't representative. They're not going to give you good information. So I haven't answered about whether 5x5 is right or 2x3 is right, but it depends on exactly what you're trying to measure, as well as a lot of other things. There were a couple of points in the discussion where I was a little bit uncomfortable about the way people were talking and thought it was still not quite grasping this idea of joint research. So Jane mentioned it when we said, okay, we researchers, we're going to give guidance. And I said, oops, no, it's not our position to give guidance. It's our position to discuss and think about this together, jointly understand each other's situation and try and find a common position. It's not researchers' position to automatically take a lead and give guidance. And also, we had people sort of saying, you know, maybe researchers would allow farmers to use manure or whatever it was. No. If this was a researcher's trial, then researchers can impose conditions and allow or disallow something. But this is not a researcher's trial. This is a joint effort. And it's not a researcher's role to allow or disallow something. The role there is to try and understand why variation comes up, why people have different positions, maybe try and explain why they come from their position of wanting to have, like every plot is either manured or not manured, but we're not putting manure on some of them. Well, what's wrong with that? You need to explain that. And I hope that people understand why putting manure on some of the plots and not on the others is going to make it difficult to understand how different these varieties are. But it's not a question of allowing or disallowing. It's a question of trying to explain your point of view and see whether others share it. There's two resources that I realize where we've covered some of these things before. If you want to, you could have a look at them. There was a seminar given November 2021, which is as a recording on YouTube, where the angle we took on this, well, what are the principles of experimentation that need to be updated or modified when we start doing this kind of research with farmers? What are the things that are really we just have to follow in terms of the way experiments are done? And what are the things that can actually be usefully modified? What about randomization, for example? When you learned experimentation when you were studying, if anybody taught you about experimental design, you will have learned that a random allocation of treatments to plots was important because you avoid any possible bias. You go and talk to farmers about randomization, and often it seems just a bizarre concept and it's a source of confusion. I would like to know that when I put variety number 1, it's the first plot, and when I go and look at my neighbor, it's also the first plot, so I know what's what on their farm as well as on my farm. Is randomization really crucial to doing a valid experiment or not? What are the situations when it is really crucial, and which are the situations when it isn't really crucial? And these are some of these principles of research that you need to think through and make sure you can understand. and are not doing something just because it's kind of nice to do it, or you're not trying to suggest that farmers do something because it's sort of, well, it's the way we always do things. Whereas if there's a real reason behind randomization, then let's try and explain that reason to farmers so they understand it and agree that, yeah, that's what we need to do, because otherwise something happens. And there's a document which is also in the resource collection on concepts of experimentation that farmers need. We wrote this a few years ago, and some projects have found it a very useful, like a little syllabus for helping farmers understand experimentation. I'd be interested if others look at it. I'm not sure if I was doing this now, I might change it a little bit, but it might be a useful thing to think about. And that one of the points which is in this document is about randomization. And it just elaborates a little bit on what is the role of randomization, and when is it really important, and when can you happily dispense with randomization without completely invalidating the research. So that's two things to follow up on later if you're interested in. In all of this, and even in the discussions we had today, we keep coming back to, so what is the real objective here? And there are different objectives which are sort of in people's minds when they're talking. You know, estimating the performance of new varieties in farmer conditions. The researchers with these varieties know that you have to grow it in real farm conditions to really understand how they perform. But the way that objective number one is stated, that is not really an FRN trial. That's a researcher's objective. If we look at objective number two, help farmers to select new varieties suitable for themselves. There, the emphasis is 100% on the farmers. As a researcher, maybe I know about these varieties. This is all to do with farmers exploring, learning about new varieties so that they can then find something that works for them. I like to think of those sorts of trials as farmer learning trials. They're very useful. A lot of the trials that FRNs do are those sorts of trials. Okay, and there a researcher might indeed help farmers think through how they can make their learning sort of valid, efficient, useful, etc. But the emphasis there is the researcher is not expecting to get valuable data, valuable results from the trial. Number three is the one that says, look, we're trying to jointly find out, how do these things perform in different contexts? How do they fit within a system? That is something that can't be done by a researcher alone. It can't be done by farmers alone. It needs that joint thing. That's the real co-designed investigation. And that's when researchers need to understand why farmers are making their suggestions, like the leaf thing. Just to say, no leaf harvesting is missing the whole point. Cowpeas in this system provide leaves for farmers, which is an important food. So a better question was, so how would you evaluate these varieties for their leaves? What do you need to understand about a variety to know whether it's going to be good for eating leaves as well as for producing grain? And make sure that the trial is going to do that. And that's a real joint investigation that requires this co-design. And maybe there are other types of objectives as well. This is my sort of summary of the way I see it. If you think about the research that we typically do, researchers come up with some objectives. They've got some principles about the general research principles. They've got principles about experimental design. They bring this together with their context and logistical things like their budget or how long they've got to do the trial in. And they put all these things together and they come up with a design. And this applies whether we're talking about experiments or other types of research as well. Those conventional designs, the things you find in research methods books, are based on these things. They take the objectives, they take these principles, and this is what you need in terms of a design. And you come up with, a randomized block design with 5 replicates and 7 treatments, or maybe you come up with something completely different. Maybe you come up with a survey which is going to be involve interviewing 120 farmers, etc., etc. But you follow this process through, you use these principles of knowledge, you apply them in a particular context, and you get scientific output at the end, if all goes well. We're talking about objectives, which are not researchers' objectives, but they are joint negotiated and agreed objectives with farmers and others involved in the FRN as well. And now, when we put together what we need to come up with a design, yes, some of these experimental design and research principles come into it, but so do other things as well, like local knowledge, like these principles of empowerment and respecting what other people are bringing to the table. Those aren't marginal. We can't say that the red ones are more important than the green ones. The whole point about this type of research is that these red and green principles or inputs are all valid and needed. If you're only going to pay attention to the red ones, then you're on the left-hand side of this diagram. And there's plenty of research which is done, by researchers for researchers that uses the red. But if we're trying to do joint and negotiated research with farmers, then the green ones come in as well. And they come together with this negotiation and capacity and things to come up with a sort of design which is often rather different from this conventional design. And the outputs will at the end be, farmers and researchers learning things. They can include scientific output, but it's not going to be the same as the scientific output that you would get if you were just following the red side. So, ultimately, the way you write it up, the sort of story you've got to publish if you're interested in publishing research is going to be different if you're on the green side than if you're on the red side. But it can still be there. So those two are not the same. And I think that was my ending point. Oh, no. Okay, co-created research is different from researcher-led investigation. So the designs and outputs will be different. As I said at the beginning, there is a power imbalance. You can't get away from the fact that there is a power imbalance. So your role as the powerful ones is to use that power wisely to advance this idea of co-created research. And that involves, amongst all the other things we've talked about, reasons for farmers making their suggestions, and there's, what does it really take to do valid research and produce valid results. And interestingly, I think Mary is on the call, or she was. I hope she's still here. I believe the next FRN working group session, which is on 24th April, is very much on this topic. Beth's going to be talking about a case from FRNs working in Western Kenya, where there seems to be something of a sort of contradiction between what farmers are doing and finding valuable and getting convinced by what they've learned and what researchers are seeing and understanding from the results. And maybe in that there'll be a chance to discuss some of these sort of differences that arise between the way researchers can look at a research problem and the sort of data that arises and the way farmers do. And our next session, we said we'd have a session on data and one on analysis. If anybody's got a strong view, my intention at the moment is to squeeze these into one session and then we stop this short series. If anybody thinks that's a really bad idea and we should extend this series to a 5th session, then shout out now or put it in the chat. Otherwise, what we'll do is we'll invent something there. And the intention is we're going to have another episode of Dr. Sayansi and Mama Kulima, but this time they're going to be exemplary in the way they negotiate together. All right, that's what I have for you today.